It was the morning of March 18th, 1912, in San Antonio, Texas, at the Southern Pacific Railway yards. The locomotive in question was Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad's number 704, and she was a 10-wheeler. We've talked about these before. 10-wheelers were an exceedingly popular class in the early 1900s and even until the end of steam. They were big enough to hold most trains, they were small enough to not be super inefficient with their size, they were good, well-rounded steam locomotives, and remained so. But on that day, something went very, very wrong. Now, the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad originally started out as the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railway, which was a very early railway in America. Although it was reincorporated as Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio, by the point of this accident, that line was a part of Southern Pacific, which today is a part of Union Pacific. Railway history! I'm stalling. Now, 704 had been involved in an accident in 1911, and it was still undergoing repairs that had just been completed. The workmen were ordered to warm her up and test her to see if she was ready for regular service again. All the repairs had been conducted, so there was no reason to think that anything horrific could be wrong. And the act of firing a steam locomotive is relatively simple. As long as all the steps are followed, it should have been fine. It was not. It was not fine at all. At 8:55 a.m., a horrific explosion occurred. Despite not being the largest locomotive to explode, this particular explosion was incredibly violent, blowing the locomotive completely apart. The split in the boiler actually happened at the bottom, which bent the walls of the cylinder outward, snapping the wheels off and throwing the boiler and all its components into the air. The pressure wave of the explosion also contained a bunch of different engine components, from pipes, levers, rods, plate, iron, grates. As this occurred in the yards, there were plenty of workmen just going about their jobs when this occurred. Many of their bodies would never be recovered, effectively being vaporized by the blast. The explosion was so strong that it uprooted trees and blasted out windows in the surrounding neighborhoods of San Antonio. Multiple residents reported finding body parts raining out of the sky and onto their properties. Many residents were injured. At least one, Mrs. Gillis, was in her home that was 7 blocks away from the roundhouse when the entire front end of 704 slammed into her roof. The home was destroyed and Mrs. Gillis was killed. As people dug through the wreckage trying to help survivors, 32 people were confirmed to be dead, and at least 50 were injured. Another 10 were missing. Why missing? Well, that's because they were standing so close to the engine that they were effectively obliterated. They were presumed dead, but only listed as missing, as they could not be confirmed to be dead or alive. So what the heck happened? Why was this explosion so violent, and what could have caused it? The engine was idling. They just fired it up. It was not in a position where an explosion should have been even considered, and yet it happened. Well, the actual cause was, yes, a crown sheet failure, which I feel like we talk about a lot here, but for those new to the channel, a crown sheet is part of a locomotive's boiler. The crown sheet needs to be kept wet while the locomotive is under heat, because otherwise it'll get dry, and then hot spots will occur. If the water touches a really hot crown sheet, instant vaporization will occur, resulting in an incredibly fast increase in pressure. If that happens and the locomotive can't contain it, an explosion will happen. The problem with this is that there's no reason why A, the crown sheet should have been dry, B, it should have been under the kind of stress to cause this kind of explosion. We've established before with other steam explosions involving crown sheet failures that more often than not what happens is a human error, where in order to try to get extra pressure out of the locomotive, some engineers and firemen will intentionally run their locomotives at low water, because while it's very risky, it can give the locomotive extra drive. But in this case, the locomotive was standing still. It wasn't pulling anything. It literally wasn't doing anything. So that theory is out. There's no reason why the water should have been low. Early on, it was considered that sabotage may have been possible, but this was ruled out pretty quickly as being very unlikely. Even though Southern Pacific was going through some difficult times, dealing with a labor strike. The vast majority of their experienced engineers, workmen, mechanics, all that, had gone on strike, and they were replaced with strikebreakers. The strikebreakers were mostly from out of town and were completely new to their jobs. Many of them hadn't been trained very well and only had a loose experience when it came to working on a railway. And therefore, two things are possible here. When it comes to a mechanical failure, 704 was actually fired up the day before and was deemed to be just fine. So that leads into human error. It's possible that because of the inefficient labor that came with the strikebreakers, somebody didn't set the water pump correctly. That's the only thought anybody has here, and it's the only real logical explanation. If someone didn't fill the water up properly, that perhaps that could have caused it. Then again, the locomotive has safety valves installed, so were they repaired improperly? I mean, it's possible, but then how did it fire up the day before without a problem? What did they do on the 18th that didn't happen on the 17th? This is a pretty violent explosion we're talking about. Someone would have had to have screwed up majorly, and to be honest, we're probably never going to get an answer as to who or what, because, like I said, the locomotive was blown apart. 704 was not rebuilt. She was ripped to shreds, and the person responsible for managing her while the fire-up was started was probably killed in the blast too, possibly one of the 10 men that are simply missing. So we're likely never to get real answers regarding this incident as to what exactly went wrong. There are also some theories that Southern Pacific intentionally let this happen as a way to frame the striking laborers, but nothing conclusive ever came of that, so that's just up to conspiracy theories. Ultimately, what happened here, no matter what the cause was the result of a crown sheet failure, and it was kind of a tragedy. It's one of the worst, if not the worst, locomotive explosions in history. And frankly, the more I talk about this, the more I keep reiterating it. Guys, keep water in your steam boilers. Seriously. This really shouldn't be this hard. And yet, it seems to be that way. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual fond farewell.